Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade. So the guys over at Distraction Makers made a video this morning talking about the bubble of new TCGs. And so what they're specifically talking about is not any kind of specifically price bubble, it's the incredible number of new TCGs that have come out recently and are coming out soon, and things announced for the future. And it's a really good video, and I really like those guys, and I'll link it down below. The thing that I want to add to it is I feel like we have never really come out of the TCG bubble of 2021 and 2022. And of course, you remember the biggest name from that time and the greatest crash and burn was MetaZoo. And yes, MetaZoo died. Yes, some people bought the IP and then relaunched it, and you haven't heard anything from it since then. But there are still a ton of games limping along from the 21 and 22 era. And, we have this second version of One Piece. There was a previous One Piece TCG back in the late 2000s or early 2010s. We have the Star Wars TCG that's running right now, which is literally the eighth or ninth Star Wars TCG in the last 30 years. I promise this one will get canceled too. I promise. Yeah, so we still have a whole lot of these games that are going along, not making a huge difference in the market and just kind of crowding the place without becoming big contenders for, say, that kind of grade A or grade B TCG slot. And so I think that the fact that you have things like Riftbound and Altered and Cookieverse and Godzilla and Gundam and all these fucking other games that are going to fail. I think the fact that you have all of them right now is not really anything different than we've seen for the last 4 years. For the last 4 years, we have seen a flood of new games from all over the place. And, one of the metrics that I really use is how difficult is it to find casual play videos of the game on YouTube, because things like Weiss, there are virtually no play videos of Weiss anywhere on YouTube because no one plays it. People collect Weiss because they like the waifu cards, and as soon as people find better looking waifu cards, they will move on. Nobody played Medicine. The cards were ugly as hell. The gameplay was not fun. Nobody ever talked about enjoying playing it. It was difficult to find play videos on YouTube, and the game failed. And that's why I go back to things like Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood has a lot of play videos. It has a lot of meta solving videos on YouTube. It has a lot of brewing videos, things like that. And that's how you know that you have a good game that has a better chance of standing the test of time. And then when it comes to things like Magic, I mean, you can drill all the way down to a specific deck in a specific format, even if it's a fringe deck in an unofficial format, and you will find hundreds of videos about that deck in that format from Magic. And so that's one of those things that I come back to again and again over time is, are people actually playing the game? Because yes, maybe a couple guys get together a few days a week at your local card store and they play Lorcana or they play One Piece or whatever else or the Star Wars or whatever. And maybe you have a pod fire off on a Friday night at your game store with it once in a while. Maybe you have that regularly. But where does it sit compared to all these other games in terms of organic player content that is made and published for it? Because that is a yardstick that I think is much more indicative than just, oh, look, the price on TCG Player, or the price of the box has done this, or, there's this many people talking about it, or, you know, things like that are not as indicative. And what you need for a game to be healthy, for a game to survive, is players. You have to have people who want to play the game because that's what creates demand for the cards. That's what gets cards sold, and it's what gets people to buy the old boxes and to come back into the store and buy the new boxes when you release a new expansion. So you have to have those players. It helps to have collectors too, because they will consume the cards also, but primarily you need players because a lot of those players have a chance of becoming collectors also, in addition to being players. So it's interesting to see that, yes, even guys like distraction makers who focus on gameplay and game design, they're seeing, hey, there are a hell of a lot of new games out there that probably are not going to make it. And, something to add to that is most of the games from the 90s failed. Most of the games in the last 25 years failed. Most of the games that are being produced today will fail. Most TCGs fail. The vast, vast majority. And it's hard for people to remember that because they become invisible when they fail. They become very hard to see in the market when you have to dig on eBay to find product from them for sale from who knows, some random guy who found some in a closet and is getting rid of it. And so they become invisible, and it becomes hard to remember just how many games came before and failed. It is a ton. It is the vast majority of them failed. And so it shouldn't really be surprising when we look out there and we see all these games with just ridiculous, dumb ideas, more IP tie in games, and things like that. And it's like, man, most of these are going to fail. Yes, most of them will, because in the past, most of them have. And there has not been some giant increase in the number of people who play TCGs. And if you look across all the people who have TCGs as a hobby, all the money that they are able to spend, it can only be split amongst so many games, and those games remain viable. You have to have economies of scale. You have to have card store buy in. You have to have distributor buy in. You have to have developers who are making enough money to pay their own bills at home so they can continue developing expansions for the game. All of that has to come from a big enough ecosystem that realizes big enough economies of scale that they can get the pricing to a point where it can compete with Magic, Pokemon, and Flesh and Blood and the other big players in the market. And that is very, very hard to do. And it's a thing that I think a lot of people who are passionately wanting to develop a game don't realize. They don't realize that if you've got to pay the bills, if you've got 4 or 5 or 10 employees in this company that's creating this card game, you got to pay for all of them. You've got to sell enough product at a enticing enough price in order to get money back all the way to you as the manufacturer in order to pay those bills. I think that a lot of these developers who have made games in the last, let's call it 5 years now, since we're at the end of 2025, a lot of them have not fully thought through the implications of how much money you have to bring in. How many cards do you have to sell? What does that translate into at realistic uptake rates of cards into how many players you have to have? When you release a new expansion, how many cases of it are you going to have to sell into the distribution system at a favorable price in order to pay your bills? And what happens if you have 1 or 2 flops of expansions in a row when you're another no name game competing for time in the marketplace? And it's a very, very, very difficult mountain to climb. And, something I've said a lot on this channel over the last several years is Flesh and Blood managed to make it. They're at what, 17th expansion now? Something like that. And they have made it. They've been around for about 6 years now, 5 or 6 years, and they did everything correct. And even then, it required an amazing alignment of fortunate events for them to make it. They could have failed, even though they did everything correct from the standpoint of developing a game properly, knowing every in and out of every nook of the industry, play testing the game for years, bringing in the right people to make sure that they had a fully developed, fleshed out game. But then also, they had a strategy for expansions, they had a strategy for competitive play, they had a strategy for managing the meta. And then they have executed competently on those things almost consistently. Almost. There have been times when they've stumbled over things, but they've learned from those lessons and improved. So they have done everything right. And even then, they could have failed if a few events had been slightly different. So never underestimate how likely it is that any game that is not Magic or Pokemon will fail. It's pretty likely they're going to. Games like Flesh and Blood that have made it 6 years and 15, 17 expansions now, they have a better chance of holding on because they are being very, very, they are pacing themselves, let's say, in terms of how they're trying to grow. They're not trying to take over the whole market and displace Magic today. Maybe in 20 years they could. Maybe, but not today. Something else that was interesting from the Distraction Makers videos is they held Sorcery kind of on the same level as Flesh and Blood. I don't agree with that, but it's interesting that they do. And so I respect their opinions a lot. And the fact that they have Sorcery on that same kind of level as Flesh and Blood is going to make me think about it more. Now, I think Sorcery has definitely not proven itself. They've had, what, two releases now, and they're teasing the third. Um, I think there are some fundamental things in the way they've said they want to manage their business that will hurt them long term in terms of the maximum addressable market share that they could ever capture. I think that they could make it financially and they could run a game that survives, but I think they will always remain very small. So I'll say that, but I will, on at the behest of distraction makers, talking about them and kind of putting them on the same level, I will think about them more and give them a different shake than I was before. So, I did a post for my patrons. I believe it was at the beginning of 2024, long time ago now. And it was my monthly newsletter either in November, December 23, or January 24, somewhere in that time frame. And I talked about all those games that were in the market at the time: MetaZoo and One Piece and Lorcana and Sorcery, and there were probably some others in there that I'm forgetting about now. I know I mentioned Weiss in that newsletter, and about all of the challenges that those games would have, and that I wouldn't be surprised to start seeing some of them failing. And then merely a few months later, we had MetaZoo go bankrupt. And even though somebody bought it out of bankruptcy and supposedly relaunched it, you really haven't heard anything about it. It hasn't made any splash. So it's a very, very, very difficult mountain to climb. You cannot underestimate, if you're trying to develop a game, just how difficult it is to climb that mountain. And the number of variables you need to take into account, the number of contingency plans for all the different things you're going to encounter. And I don't even mean that, you have to have a plan in case this situation works out in one of 10 ways. I don't even mean that. It's thousands of situations. Your plan for how to handle distributors. How do you get game stores to pay attention to you? How do you get players interested in your game? How do you introduce the game to players? How do you teach the game? How are the rules written? Simply, how are they written from a standpoint of trying to get some person who does not have an already enfranchised player to teach them? How do you write the rules so that person on their own can understand them and pick up the game? There's all those individual challenges that you have to go through with these things. And it's an unbelievable level of work. And then it's still probably going to fail. The odds of us seeing another Flesh and Blood are very, very, very low. The odds of a game like, especially these IP tie-in games, like the Godzilla game, Gundam, One Piece, Lorcana, all of these, odds are they will be canceled at some point. The Star Wars game that's hot right now, we already know that's going to get canceled at some point. It's literally the eighth or ninth one in the last 30 years. So, all of these games have very, very, very shaky roads ahead, and a lot of them are going to fail. The odds that something like Altered, or what's the Librarian game, or the Cookieverse game, or whatever the hell other game, the odds that one of them will become the next Flesh and Blood are vanishingly rare. And so to tie that back into us as degenerate investors who simply like to occasionally play the games, well, man, you got to watch what you're putting your money into. I warned people about MetaZoo a lot because what I had seen is what I mentioned a few minutes ago. Nobody played the game. Yeah, I know you and your buddy may have played it once or twice. Maybe there were two guys at your card store who played it, but by and large, People did not play the game. And so long term, the support from the market was not going to be there. And I was fortunate that I never spent a single dollar on MetaZoo. I've never spent a single dollar on Lorcana, on One Piece, on Weiss, on all these other ones, because why would you need to? We've looked at the long term performance of Pokemon, we've looked at the long term performance of Magic collector boxes. Those things do amazing. Why do you need to take gambles on products that all of history tells us are almost certainly going to fail? It doesn't make a lot of sense from a risk analysis perspective. So go check out that Distraction Maker video. Subscribe to those guys. I think they're really good at what they do, and they are really interesting in the way they break down game design and that whole section of the ecosystem. Let me know what you think, guys. Thanks to everyone who makes this content possible, especially my very generous supporters on Patreon. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade.